I'm David Luberoff. I'm the coordinator, moderator of Open Classroom, and I should take my own advice and speak into the microphone. And tonight we're continuing our sort of dive into planning in Boston. Those of you who were here last week got a terrific overview presentation from Sarah Meyerson, who as of last week was the executive director of Imagine Boston 2030, but as of last night is now the director of planning for the Boston Redevelopment Authority. I don't think it's a coincidence. And Matthew Littell from UTIL, one of the consultants working on that project, with some wonderful commentary from Anthony Flint. Really fascinating conversation, I thought. For those of you who were not here and might be interested in it, it is now up on YouTube. If you go to the main channel, the main webpage, excuse me, for Open Classroom, you will find that video. And in general, all of the videos will be up typically by the next week, hopefully sooner. As Matthew mentioned last week, the current planning effort is the first effort to produce a comprehensive master plan in Boston in 50 years. And a few things have changed in 50 years in Boston. A couple of us were talking about, for example, what used to be here. This wasn't here. The Red Sox had not won a World Series in quite many years at that point, and were a horrifically bad team at that point in time that nobody took real seriously. And if you looked carefully at some of the slides that Matthew showed of the 1965 plan, you would have seen a circular stadium near South Station. That plan, among other things, called for replacing Fenway Park with a stadium similar to the circular stadiums that went up in places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, that we later tore down so that we could build stadiums that looked like Fenway Park. So Boston, by not doing that, stayed ahead of the curve. And of course, there were many other more serious changes as well. But I thought as we started this exploration of what would a comprehensive plan for Boston look like, it would be really interesting to go back and say, let's think about this document, the 1965-1975 general plan for the city of Boston and the regional core. This is the plan that we were talking about, and it's a fascinating document to read. It correctly identifies the emergence of Boston as a city of ideas and something that the city would be a key to the city's growth. It misses a few notable changes that happened. It called for certain policies that were not adopted and, in fact, in many cases were ardently resisted via a sort of citizen activist movement that really was not apparent in 1965. And so I thought it would be fun and interesting and informative to go back and find some people who were involved either with the plan or some of the reactions to the plan, some of the efforts to implement the plan, and get them to reflect on this. And fortunately, we have those people with us tonight. So Tunny Lee, who many of you know, was the director of design for the 1965 plan, was the BRA's head of planning and design, went on, as many of you know, to an illustrious career. I could spend the whole night just telling you Tunny's resume, but I won't, other than to say he, among other things, was the head of MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and also the director of the Division of Capital Projects, DCPO, and what's the O? Basically the state's capital budgeting and asset agency. So Tunny is going to walk us through a little bit of the plan and give us some thoughts about what the plan may have gotten right, what the plan may have gotten wrong, what effects it may have had or didn't have, and what that might teach us about comprehensive planning. And as we did last week, we'll go from there to a discussion, and were joined by Byron Rushing, again, who many of you know, who became quite active in Boston with some of the efforts to stop many of the key elements of this plan and other related city plans in this particular area, the Southwest Corridor, urban renewal plans for Roxbury and the South End, and later as the head of the Museum of African American History, and since the mid-'80s, one of the stellar state representatives that we have been fortunate to have representing us. And then Tony Pangaro. Tony, as many of you know, Tony came on slightly later, but your first job was working for Ed Logue, I believe, and Tony, when Ed was in New York, Ed Logue being the head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority when this plan came out, comes back to Boston to build the Southwest Corridor project, which is an interesting result of this plan, not called for it, but one of the things that came out of it. And then, of course, on to a fabulous, successful career as a private developer, doing a variety of projects that in many respects were envisioned by the plan. The high spine concept in Boston of high-rise development down through the Back Bay, turning around at what the so-called Hinge Block, which is right next to the Millennium Project, which was one of Tony's projects, and now involved with the Filene's project. So I thought that as someone involved with both the Southwest Corridor, but also as a developer carrying out arguably some of the plan's vision, Tony would give us also an interesting perspective on the legacy of the plan. So we'll start with Tony. We'll do a short presentation on the 65 plan, and then we'll move to discussion. We'll take a break at around 7. And then go to Q&A and comments and reflections from many of you, some of whom I already know were also actively involved in this.
Well, thank you all for coming up on this cold night to look at now an ancient artifact. David asked me to really go back and look at the plan. I worked on it 50 years ago, and I was one of the foot soldiers in the plan. There were many people involved, and trying to reflect on why was it developed, what was in the plan, and what got implemented, what was the social and political context for the plan, and what can we learn from this. I think you have to start back a little bit from 1965. I think the city and the region in 1950 was in dire straits. Manufacturing in Boston, it was one of the major manufacturing centers, New England, peaked in 1916, and it had been falling ever since. Textiles, shoes, and leather, in which New England was the prime manufacturers, supplied most of the U.S. with all those products, was decimated by competition, not from China, but from the South and the Midwest. There had been no new office buildings in the downtown built after about 1930. Note that the population was fixed at around 1924 because the 1924 Act halted European immigration. What was coming to Boston was migration from the South and the Caribbean. But by 1950, the population to 1980 had dropped from 800,000 and this peaked to 563,000. So if you look at Boston in 1940, 1950, the tallest building you can see, and I've circled it because you'll see why in the next. And there had been no new, the Custom House was the tallest building in Boston. By a few years ago, the Custom House Tower had to be picked out to see it as the growth of the financial district dominated thing. What's happened with the city was the West End got built, Government Center, other South End, other projects here, but a substantial change in the city by 2010, 2000. The city was a very different city. It had become, its economy had revived, the population had regrown, and the question is, how did it get there from the 1950s? And what were the factors involved? And how was the plan a part of that? You have to remember that the first solutions to the Boston's ills was highways and urban renewal. The growth of 128, where development was going out into the suburbs, suburbanization, segregation of the population. I think the suburbs essentially closed to minority groups. I think they call them restrictive covenants were not abolished until the 50s, and even after that, the suburbs were really mostly, almost exclusively white. Slum clearance was a goal. The way to fix the city was to get rid of the old housing stock. We needed to provide industrial space. The question was, the city was losing manufacturing because we had no industrial space. And also that the middle class was key to reviving the city. So as a result, we built highways to bring back industry, bring back the middle class. Unfortunately, highways run both ways. And urban renewals, kind of total clearance of projects, was felt necessary in order to build housing for the middle class, as the West End project, which you all know too well. The New York Streets project was the first project, in fact, first urban renewal project, and it was built for industrial use. And the how far have we gone is that the Herald moved from Newspaper Row to New York Streets. The Herald is now gone and is replaced by a project called Ink Block. And so we're now back to residential, but of a wholly different kind. The city's politics changed completely. The previous administration, partly because of urban renewal and the highways, but also partly because of the stagnation of the city, the onerous taxes, essentially elected a maverick candidate. The candidate for the establishment that was supposed to succeed Hines was Powers, the Senate president, and John Collins was the clerk of the county clerk, I believe. But anyway, he came in and changed the city entirely. He proposed a $90 million renewal plan. I think you'll see in the later plan that this is the basis for most of the planning. Why was it necessary to do a 1965 plan? By 1965, the 1960 Urban Renewal Program was well underway. Government Center, Xpwy, South End, Waterfront, etc. Federal and state requirements for urban renewal projects had to conform to a general plan. The zoning, the city was revising its zoning and needed guides to that. The city was also preparing a massive capital improvement program for public facilities, and the plan was to guide that as well. By 1965, the Prudential and State Street banks, the first office buildings built in Boston since the 30s, were well underway. Government Center was under construction, City Hall, federal building, and these were all essential to change the way in which real estate investment was being made. Castle Square, unlike New York streets, was built as a moderate income housing. Washington Park plan was well underway. The Martin Luther King Boulevard, church-sponsored housing. So the general plan, which David has just shown you, was created. It was the contents was the main emphasis was on the urban renewal and improvement areas. They looked at the cities as a whole, and as David already mentioned, it really understood that the old economy was gone and the new economy is going to be based on Boston's strengths. The hospitals, the universities, the creative industries. The plan also expressed real frustration with a lack of regional cooperation. It proposed a massive plan for housing, but wished that the suburbs would share the burden. That was not to come, as we all know. It recognized early the emergence of a substantial African-American neighborhood, some of which came from the South in the Great Migration, and many of which came from the Caribbean. The plan issue, if you all take a look at it, was actually it was one of the, probably at that time, a very well put together plan. The graphics were well in advance of its time. The layout and the comprehensiveness of the plan. So it essentially says that the main function of this text, with accompanying tables, charts, and so on, the general plan for the city of Boston, is to provide an equally general, ambitious, but realizable statement of policies and objectives for Boston's renewal, not as a static vision of the Boston of tomorrow, but as a statement of concrete proposals. The plan attempts to give explicit direction to the ideals that underlie the development program. And the program was idealistic. It proposed correcting the housing, correcting the school systems, etc. So the contents of the plan had the usual physical assets, a design for the city, but also has substantial separate plans for human resources. The Boston Redevelopment Authority and the city at that point was concerned with human renewal with the creation of ABCD in conjunction with the urban renewal plan. Analysis of the population, of stemming the decline, and actually in 10 years bringing the city back to 700,000. Public facilities, the city over the decades had really not renewed its public facilities. Institutions were emerging and had to be dealt with, and so on with commerce and industry, transportation, etc. The characteristics of the plan, it was specified as an action-oriented, and that was completely linked to the urban renewal program that requires specific commitments and fixed time limits. So it was less of one of these general plans in which goals are set many years in advance. A synthesis of other plans, and the school plan was done by the Harvard School of Education. The commercial facilities was done by Robert Gladstone Associates. These are all very substantial studies done to back up the plan. So there was I think it's ironic, not ironic, but it's telling that one of the main parts of Mayor Walsh's State of the City yesterday was the schools and the plan for the schools. That says something about plans for schools that are especially volatile and need to be updated frequently. But this was a look at the whole city and what the needs for the schools were. Similarly, there were looks at libraries, police stations, fire stations, and so on, and the development at that point of a public facilities department in the city for the first time. And there was also an attempt to use public facilities to tie the city together. So now I think this map also shows probably one of the real problems with planning for the city within the region. As you can see, the city is distorted. It only occupies one piece of the region. Brookline is missing, Cambridge, Chelsea, Somerville, etc. And that, of course, is a severe handicap. So what happened between 1965 and 1975? It was one of the most volatile periods in our nation's history and also the city's history. In 1965, the first combat troops arrived in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was unpopular. Therefore, there was no taxes available, and the urban renewal plans, housing programs began to be gutted. And Nixon puts the finishing touches on it by ending urban renewal and the housing programs. At the same time, the civil rights movement is emerging. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and the urban riots that followed changed completely the way in which the African communities work with the city. And one that we don't think of so much, but very important, was the Immigration Act of 1965, which changed the way the composition of Boston's population. The last time Boston now has something like 25% foreign born, and the portions, as you can see, is dominated by Latinos, followed by Asians, and somewhat from Brazil and other places. But the only group that is still on this list are the Irish. The Irish in 1910 was number one, followed by Italians and Russians. So these immigrants are key to what happened in Boston. They've filled and stabilized many of the neighborhoods in Boston. So the implementation of the plan, what happened? The urban renewal projects continued, but the demographic projections, school plans, they're rendered obsolete by busing and the continued white flight out of the city. The stopping of the Inner Belt and Southwest Expressway opened opportunities for development that was not there before. In the city context, the busing, of course, was a huge controversy and accelerated white flight. Essentially, the white population of Boston evacuated in that period. The anti-highway movement, the highway plan was a central part of the plan, the highway proposals in Boston. But the anti-highway movement stops the highways and institute the Boston Transportation Planning Review. Also, the emergence of the community development corporations was essential in changing the character of the housing of the city. As you can see in this, the highway, the inner belt, just lightly covers the path through Cambridge, which would have gone down right through Central Square. What happened there was interesting because among the people who started the anti-highway movement were people who were staff of the BRA. Fred Salvucci, myself, Dennis Blackett, and others were all working for the BRA at that time. Fred and I looked at the path through Boston, and it had already been mainly demolished because landlords had stopped taking care of it, so there were vacant lands. So the path through Boston, we thought was going to be an improvement over what was there. But then he and I drove down Brookline Elm Streets in Cambridge and were appalled by the taking of probably 2,000 housing units of perfectly good, workable housing. So that was one of the many people who started the anti-highway movement, the Southwest Corridor, from people from Roxbury and people from Milton, all joined together to form one of the great coalitions against the highway. The plan, the 65 plan, showed the inner belt and the Southwest Corridor fairly innocuously. It was seen as something you could span with air rights, and Fenway was a little ornamental waterway at top. But the reality of that highway is staggering. This is a shot looking north. The blue arrow is about where we are. Where we are today would have been part of the inner belt. Ruggles Station, it's in the middle of the interchange. Most of Northeastern's development on the side would have been subsumed under the expressway. The Roxbury Community College would not exist because the site was taken. But that was substantial for changing the plan. I doubt today whether a Republican governor would make that action. I doubt a politician today would say, I was wrong, or we were wrong. Because he was the Public Works Commissioner, and he was the governor who stopped the highways. And he instituted the Boston Transportation Planning Review, which changed the way in which we thought about the highways and about transportation. The orange line that got us here, got me here anyway, sort of, was part of that plan. But most substantially, if you go to Ruggles Station and look both ways, if that plan had been stopped, you would have been standing under a highway interchange. So the Southwest Corridor, which I think Tony might talk about a bit, shows here. Northeastern is here. I think F building is probably right about there. There's the police headquarters. There's the new Health Commission. There's a substantial amount of housing in what was the Lower Roxbury Community Development Corporation, now the Madison Park, along the inner belt, along many other projects. Urban Edge Housing, Roxbury Community College. All these would not exist today and were not in the plan, for sure. I think, just this is a quick diagram that I put together, that the crisis of the city, white flight busing, is part of the overall scheme. But the urban renewal and urban highways were the solutions. That created the anti-highway, anti-renewal movement. That stopped both of them in some ways. What was left was a legacy of citizen participation as a beginning point and public land. Those two ingredients were key, along with the activists who had emerged out of these movements, became the CDCs, the Community Development Corporations, so that most of the housing built in Boston, subsidized housing built in Boston, were a result and sponsored by locally owned and locally managed housing. And it makes a huge, substantial difference in the way housing is perceived. So if you look at the Inner Belt and the Southwest Expressway and the Urban Renewal Program in Boston, you can see that almost all the CDCs are located within those areas. So what are some observations out of it? Plans are only guides and need continuous updating because events do not stand still for plans. Trends are not predictions. We're limited by our human ability to only continue trends. It's almost impossible to predict what happened in 1965 and 1975. International, national, regional factors are not within the control of the city. The success in Boston, in some ways, required the involvement of every sector of the city. That is, you cannot ignore the private sector, you cannot ignore the institutions, you cannot ignore the government. And you have to stop treating people, neighborhoods, as disposable, which I think would happen in the early urban renewal programs. The early citizen participation, planning with people, were clearly inadequate. But it evolved over time, and people took those ideas and brought them further. And the empowerment of the neighborhoods is key to a city's success. The beginnings of that was clearly in the plan, but how it progressed depended a lot more on the way in which the communities organize. One last piece I think that makes Boston different is the collaboration of the city and the state, and the fact that the state capitals in the city, I think, made a huge difference in the way in which the city and the state would collaborate. When you look at, because one of the things that you have to reflect on Boston is not all the things that went wrong in the city and how inadequate it is today in meeting its goals, but what would have happened if all these things did not happen. I think there are many, many reasons why cities behave differently, but in the Northeast, Boston was one of the few cities that came out of the manufacturing crisis and the change in the cities and for instance, why did Baltimore not develop in the same way? They had many programs, they had renewal of their waterfront, but I think my guess is one of the reasons is that the ability to, in fact, some ways, exchange people between city and state governments were crucial, and that the fact that the state people had to ride and use the city streets makes a big difference, where states in which rural people really feel that the city is not worth dealing with. So I think in conclusion, I would say that the plan played a part in the following development of the city, but that it was more in the process rather than the specifics. Thank you.